Our first panelist is Robert Jones, accompanied by Margaret, his wife, who works with the state of California on environmental issues as well. He's the director and founder of the EchoLinks Foundation. Next speaker, Dr. Quirero Yen. He earned his doctorate at Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He has worked and done research on youth and their quest for meaning. He will tell us something about the role that he played in a rather unique event in Beijing when they had the Beijing Expo. Next speaker, Dr. Jili Sun. Dr. Sun got her DEUG degree from the Institut Catholique de Paris. She is now teaching at Northwest University in Chicago.
In the early 2000s, for about the first decade, China, particularly the provinces, were racked by tens of thousands of demonstrations and protests, and most of them were about pollution in its various forms. The air in many parts of China, even in the main cities, was so thick with coal dust, vehicle exhaust fumes, and a cocktail of other pollutants that the people lived in a perpetual, almost perpetual, murky twilight, as you can see from these shots here. And the rivers, many of the rivers were just chock full of detritus, waste material, and in some cases, chemicals. And I remember one of the trips that Maggie and I took to China, I think about 2006, there was an explosion at a chemical plant on the Songhua River in the northeast, sending hundreds of tons of chemicals into that river. And unfortunately, that river was the sole source of drinking water for probably hundreds of thousands of people in the region. And also the land. Much of the land was so toxic with various types of pollution that you couldn't farm it. And at this time, the international climate change issue was coming to the fore. China had become the climate change superpower, if you will, of the world. China was the largest emitter of greenhouse gases and had displaced the United States by emitting over 10 billion metric tons per year of greenhouse gases, about 25% of the global total. So China was under a lot of pressure from the international community, even at that time, to start reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And nearly 70% of China's energy was coming from fossil fuels. And a large percentage of that was actually from the dirtiest of all fossil fuels, from coal. But for China, climate change has always been very much an equity issue. China was a developing country, and some might argue still is, and it needed to be given the opportunity to build its economy and not be held back by environmental regulations. And of course, the West, the United States, Britain, Japan, etc., had had several decades to build their economies. So they'd done extremely well, thank you very much. And China wanted to be afforded the same opportunity to build its economy. Well, since that time, China has done pretty well in regard to the economy. China's economy is the second largest in the world after the United States, and about 60% of our GDP, and is expected to actually overtake the United States economy within the next decade or so. But even more importantly, by some estimates, China has managed to bring upwards of half 1 billion people, that's billion with a B, out of abject poverty to join the ranks of the middle class. So this is a huge achievement on China's part. And China was able to do this, as you probably know, by becoming the workshop of the world, taking advantage of the lower wages in China, the very much, or very less stringent, I should say, environmental laws in that country. And what happened was that many in China were complaining that the companies of the rich world who had set up shop in China, manufacturing for their domestic markets back home, and also for the expanding Chinese domestic market, were exporting their own pollution to China. And China was having to pay the price for this. And to some, this sort of harkened back to the days of the Qing dynasty, the late 19th century, early 20th century, during the so-called century of humiliation, and was very much like a form of neo-colonialism through the MNCs, the multinational corporations. Now, the Chinese government at this time was becoming very nervous about these protests that were taking place all over. And they didn't want them to spin out of control, obviously, so they asked SEPA, the State Environmental Protection Administration, to contact the state of California. And the officials in SEPA were already very much aware of our environmental history, our meaning California and the United States. And they were familiar with the stories about the smog-filled skies of Los Angeles during the 1960s, and the environmental movement that followed, and the legislation, very importantly, that followed that. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act at the federal level in the United States, California's version, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and the seminal legislation of the 1970s, particularly in 1970 itself, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and many others followed. And the people who were dealing with California from SEPA, the State Environmental Protection Administration, had also read very widely about what had happened in the United States. They could quote from Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's very well-known authoritative piece about the way that we in the United States had trashed our environment through using DDT and other toxic chemicals. And SEPA wanted to find out how California had dealt particularly with the public, with a restive public like we had in not just California, but in very many parts of the United States. And they wanted to learn about public participation, how to get the general public involved in environmental decision making. And what happened was that a series of trainings took place across China, from the shining metropolises of Beijing and Shanghai, and to far-flung places like Urumqi in the west, the home of the Uyghurs, and also to places like Chengdu and Kunming and Guiyang, and also Harbin on the border with Russia. And I remember well the first mock public participation meeting that we had was actually in Xinjiang province in Urumqi, home to the Uyghurs. And of course that would never happen today. But that's where we had our first one. And we played different parts in this mock public participation meeting. And these meetings, incidentally, involved SEPA and involved provincial and city environmental protection bureaus and also the NGO community in China, particularly the Gongos, the government-organized NGOs in the country. And California was in the ideal position to help. And because of its geographical proximity to China, because of its cultural ties, which went back 150 years to the days of the gold rush and the construction of the railroads. And also, you know, the descendants of these people, these Chinese immigrants, have become very much a part of the fabric of the state of California. And at this time, there was a shared environmental concern about pollution being generated in China, which was finding its way across the Pacific Ocean via the jet stream to the west coast, and particularly to California. So this was an existential problem that we really had to deal with at the time. And just to give you some idea as to the problem with the highly polluted air, I mean, you can see it right there. In 2017, just a few years ago, the British medical journal Lancet reported that 1.24 million people had perished in China as a result of the highly polluted air. So that gives you some idea as to the seriousness of the problem that they had there. Now, the ultimate success of our program in China hinged on building mutual trust, mutual respect and understanding, and of course, personal relationships, many of which are ongoing today. And speaking of today, China's environment, of course, is by no means perfect, but they've made considerable strides. They've done very, very well. There are no longer any of these episodes of foul air, like during the so-called Airmageddon and apocalypse references, rather vague references to the Bible, which occurred in 2012 and 2013. And China is expected to reach zero or net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. And it looks like the President Xi Jinping is now, or has now put himself in charge of climate change, as he has with many other things, of course. And the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, is in charge again of climate change in China. So that's great news. They've set up a new carbon emissions trading, a national carbon emissions trading system, replacing just the 7 provinces that were involved over the last few years. They are the largest manufacturer and user of EVs, electric vehicles, in the world, leaving the United States scrambling to try and catch up. And also, China is hoping to get upwards of 20% of its energy from renewable sources by the end of this decade. And so, let me move on to dumpling diplomacy. Now, I can see some puzzled looks on your faces. What the heck is dumpling diplomacy? And for a little bit of help, I'm going to ask Margaret to explain that to you. Margaret, my wife, who did a lot of this dumpling diplomacy, and she's a great lover of dumplings, actually, amongst other things. But she'll explain it to you. It's rather like ping-pong diplomacy in the early 1970s after President Nixon's visit to China. And so anyway, without further ado, let me introduce my wife, Margaret.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be rather brief, but because I did the actual training, I'm still with the state of California. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I'm going to talk about government-to-government collaboration, building one dumpling at a time, and we'll get to that towards the end, what it really means. But I also, because of this occasion to work with the Chinese Environmental Protection Agency, I also had the occasion to do my Fulbright teaching administrative law in Beijing University, as well as I was a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, public policy, environmental policy. So as Robert explained, we were invited by the Chinese Environmental Protection Agency. And at that time, I was appointed by Governor Gray Davis to serve in the Energy Commission as what's called public advisor, a lawyer who's making sure that public's well represented in government decision making. And at the time when they invited us, I was supposed to be working, and I did work with American Bar Association, Yale China Law Center, and the US State Department. And the important thing is, when they invited us to help them, because of the growing protests, they had like 60,000 protests a year because of pollution. Grandpas, grandmas in China, they said, hey, we had enough of this, and they were very vocal about the discontent of the disasters. And at that time, when they reached out, we knew that we were not in a position to teach China what to do. We were not trying to be arrogant, but we wanted to share our experiences. So when I examined what was wrong, what was going on in China, I quickly found that they had laws, environmental laws, and they were pretty good. And some of the laws were kind of pretty much similar to what we had. So what was wrong with the pollution in China? And what we found was the implementation and enforcement did not really exist well. And that, later on, I found out, was a result of, first, understanding of law and how it applies. It was different. It's more of a negotiation. It's not black and white like we see here. And number two, there was lack of public participation and lack of nonprofit groups, civil society groups to engage in government decisions. So they understood that. So they said, Margaret, we want you to teach them public participation. So it was a government-to-government exchange. And initially, they were very suspicious when we were talking about how the importance of public participation, you can't just build what you want and expect everyone to go along with it when their life is in danger. And they said, yeah, maybe the US is trying to slow down our economy. And so they were very suspicious of our motives, but we wanted to genuinely share our experiences, both success and failure. And they were really excited about our failure. They would laugh and they said, I can't believe you're sharing your failures. And of course, we're here to share our experience, and we want to make sure that they decide what to do. So what happened was the Europeans really wanted to bring selective participation. But the US, we were all about anyone can participate. And initially they said, this is crazy. You guys are crazy to let anyone participate in government decision making. And they said, they started asking, like, can grandma participate? Can handicapped people participate? And they were so excited to learn about our public participation. One day, after several years of training, we were invited to a high-ranking official to their home for dumpling making, dinner. And when I shared this to our State Department and other people who have been working there years before us, they said, you're kidding. You are invited to this high-ranking person's official's home for dumpling making and dinner? And we said, yes. And what is the significance? And they said, that means that you have built friendship, trust, and respect. And so that is how we were able to do it. One dumpling at a time, making and sharing, and not being arrogant about the fact that we weren't there to teach them what to do, but to just to share our experiences. And ultimately, I was able to help pass the first legislation on public participation. It's quite different now, but it worked back then.
I'm going to share a bit my experience at the Holy See Pavilion in Beijing, in the Beijing Expo. And I rejoice at the, of course, at the Laudato Si, the publication of Laudato Si, and also the commitment of China in ecological civilization. And China developed from a backward economy with pollution problems, but also it is now committed to ecology. And at the end, I will also share some experiences of Catholic response to Laudato Si. Empirical data have shown humankind's negative effect on the environment. Pollution, waste, diminishing available water, biodiversity loss, decline in human life quality, and global inequality. Publication of Laudato Si impacted on the Paris Agreement in 2015. Both China and the US adhere to reduce global carbon emission. What previous Copenhagen summit didn't succeed. While now we are at the pandemic, we're experiencing the pandemic now, and also the recent widespread floods in Europe and also in Zhengzhou, China. It's a sign that we are not doing enough. An integral approach and with concerted effort is necessary to combat this ecological crisis. Sorry?
It's not.
Moving. Can you move? And without diplomatic relations, Vatican participated at the Beijing Expo 2 years ago on horticulture with an Holy See Pavilion. Is such a high-level international event for the first time. The Pontifical Council for Culture assigned me as the coordinator. I was there at the pavilion for 6 months. Let's watch some slides there. A platform for communication. It was not a religious venue, but it's appropriate for cultural exchange, especially with a country like China, officially atheist, the population mostly religiously unaffiliated. The Holy See Pavilion has received an estimate of 4 million visitors. It featured the Vatican Gardens, but it also presented themes highlighted in the Laudato Si. 2 principal works of arts are exposed there. One is a 500-year-old gilded olive tree bearing a quotation from the Laudato Si, from Pope Francis. Whether believers or not, we are agreed today that the earth is essentially a shared inheritance, whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. Another work is an 18th century painting by Peter Wenzel, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It captures the moment when Adam and Eve were about to eat the forbidden fruit. In a way, it damaged all kinds of harmonious relationships with nature, with God, and among human beings. It conveyed a harmonious relationship in the creation. In the middle, there's a monolith in the middle of the pavilion, resembles a baptismal fountain. 4 strips of water cascade down from top inscribing a cross shape. Soil sample, purpose taken from the Garden of Gethsemane, is applied on the golden frame of the Garden of Eve painting. The Garden of Eden painting. And it recalls the passion of Christ. It is subtle, it's a subtle message, but strong. Humans destroy harmony in nature and relationships, but Jesus, the new Adam, with his death and resurrection, restores it. I rejoice at the encyclical Laudato Si message, but I found also many similarities with the concept of ecological civilization that China is promoting. The expo theme was Live Green, Live Better, aims to promote respect for nature and better life in harmony with nature. I found many similarity points in the inauguration speech of Xi Jinping with Laudato Si of Pope Francis. He said, all humans live in a community with a shared future. Collaboration is necessary to tackle environmental issues. And he promised that China will accelerate to construct ecological civilization, pursue economic prosperity, but through sustainable green development. He did not mention about God, of course, but he emphasized on human wisdom and scientific policies, sound scientific policies should be implemented. He also said nature will punish all those who disobey. Take nature's punishes and rewards. The rise and fall of society is dependent on its relationship with nature. So he emphasized also an integral approach, as in the Laudato Si, raise people's awareness and ecological conservation in social life. He promised to work together with other countries and to be responsible for future generations. So China, as we can see from these two pictures, has developed from a backward economy and industrialized in recent decades. The world knows well the pollution was acute, but few are aware air quality across China has improved in recent years due to countless big-scale green initiatives. With holistic approach, long-term planning, and commitment in global climate agreements, scholars believe that China stands a good chance of achieving an ecological civilization, with successful development model contributing to the protection of the global ecosystem. Because China has been poor, it industrialized, so in a way it has this experience of transition. Chinese ministries estimated the Marshall Plan of investment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 stand at a massive 100 trillion renminbi, meaning 14 trillion US dollars over the next 30 years, starting from the next 5-year plan. Of course, this is dynamic. It can still improve. Next, I share something about Catholic responses, maybe with three experience that I know. One is I was talking with Father Ran from Shanxi province, I met him a few months ago. He said the pandemic, in a way, for him was the past year was a year of good harvest. It's like the pandemic was like a blessing in disguise. For a few months, children didn't have school and have to stay home in the villages, in the countryside. And he said, I built some facilities, and they are always around to play around, and then I had a chance to give them catechisms and other activities. Also, we in our community, the Fukurai community, in Shanghai, we take profit of this occasion. We organize many outdoor activities like camping for children and for teens, visiting wetlands, appreciating birds and nature, speak to them about Pope Francis, Francis of Assisi, and the Laudato of Pope Francis. We also Zoom with children and their parents in the evening for prayers, for other things. Even for adults, it was an occasion for reflection, spend time with the family, with nature, not always in a hurry, and feel a peace of mind. Also at Expo, we had a program for children to appreciate nature and to color the sketch of a forgotten bird in the painting of, it so happened that in the painting of Wenzel, there were 2,000 animals and birds painted, but there was one sketch of a bird he forgotten to paint. So with the children, we had this activity to let them complete this work. At the same time, building this relationship with nature and among themselves. See the paintings. And on the Earth Day last year, Pope Francis reiterates the need for ecological conversion and invites us to pray for the International Conference on Biodiversity in Kunming, China, and most particularly for the upcoming summit on climate change in Glasgow. And health permit, probably he might attend that, and also certainly President Xi Jinping will be going there. So we also pray for that. I believe that whatever we do, whether completing this forgotten bird or building our conference, the forgotten bird.
You see next to the 3 apples, there's a little
Yeah, right.
of a bird that was never filled in.
Yes.
That's what we have to do.
Really cool.
So whether painting this, completing this unfinished work, or building our conference together here, or praying for the Glasgow meeting, I think is also our contribution, an act of our contribution to complete this unfinished work. So I'll leave this, not the whole painting, but this forgotten bird painting to the U.S.-China Association, so that it reminds us that whatever we do is a contribution for this unfinished work. Thank you.
So, the title is The Nature's Voice, Chinese Artists' Contribution to the Protection of the Environment. So this paper explores how Chinese Christian artists express their love of nature through diverse artistic linguistic forms. We chose to analyze the 2 Chinese artists, the paper carting work of Ping Liu and the flower arrangement work of Qin Li. Both Li and Liu combine their artistic works with literary expressions through the close analysis of the interaction between linguistic form and artistic form. In their work, we examine how diverse expressive channels can be combined to create a unique expression of Christian spirituality. So in this study, we took into account the specificity of Chinese language and the love of nature deeply rooted in Chinese culture. We observed how these heritages guided Christian artists to form innovative channels to express the environment around us, a beautiful and divine creation. Okay, so this is the outline of my talk. So begin with the first one, the central place of the nature in Chinese traditional culture. So according to Zhuangzi, an ideal lifestyle manifests in harmony between human and the nature. So there is the famous quote from his work, 齐物论, heaven, earth, and I come into being together, and all things and I are one. So, in different periods, this love of nature was realized and expressed in many Chinese literature work. A noted classic essay collection, 小窗幽记, first published in 1622, authored by Lu Shaoheng, described the Chinese lifestyle in a poetic way, a simple combination of intellectual and artistic life accompanied with the beauty of the nature, the wind, the flowers, the four seasons. This book was authored during a very chaotic late Ming Dynasty period, but even 400 years later, the love of nature, the simple and artistic lifestyle is treasured by Chinese culture. The Christianity entered in interaction with Chinese culture through Catholic and Protestant missionaries. It went through a stimulant and sometimes very difficult dialogue with the Chinese philosophical traditions. I am a Protestant from tradition. My family was a sixth-generation Protestant family, so I know better the Protestant church context. So in the second point, since my arrival in the US in 2006, I have been in contact with a Chinese overseas Protestant church. So in the second point, I will introduce the current overseas Protestant churches context. In current Protestant churches, the expressions of Christian faith has a very strong focus on Bible studies because of the Protestant tradition to rely on the Bible as sole reference of authority. Nevertheless, there are following challenges for them. First one, a huge diversity of biblical interpretation of different Protestant theology based on diverse interpretative method applied to the Bible. Secondly, the division in social issues such as politics, social reforms originated in diverse biblical interpretations. These divisions caused intense debate and division among clergymen and churches. The 2020 presidential election reached the peak of this division among overseas Chinese Christian churches and caused a lot of pain within the churches. The third challenge is the decentralization nature of Protestant churches' administration. Many overseas Chinese churches are independent churches. Administrators such as elders or deacons are usually lay people and not trained in theology. And it's very hard for them to analyze in an objective, neutral, and professional way. They often turn to their personal understanding of the Bible or seek for help from one or two theologians they feel comfortable to work with. But the solution turned out often biased and difficultly defendable, even all these solutions claim to be rely on scripture. Then the next challenge is the heterogeneity of biblical knowledge of lay people. The biblical study in overseas Protestant churches are led by lay people or pastors, but the interpretative methods and topic to choose usually heavily rely on the leaders or clergyman's personal preference. Lay Christians receive their initiation of biblical interpretation through Sunday school or fellowship, but it's hard for them to have objective view on the study material or to make informed choices on subject to study. At the same time, the method of 京剧背诵, recite single biblical verses, very much practiced in Bible studies, produce often out of context understanding of the biblical verses without critical thoughts and holistic understanding of the main biblical messages. All these difficulties make it very difficult for lay people to find a common ground of discussion, to participate in complex debate, or to make objective judgments. And the next challenge is the tension between Christian identity and Chinese identity. At the beginning of Protestant mission, the Christian faith were often presented in opposition or in competition with Chinese traditional values. It created crisis of identity for many Chinese Christians. A question persistently arises for them is, can we be a Christian and a Chinese at the same time? This question is always present throughout the Protestant mission history in China. In this situation, how to find an applicable method to live and express Christian faith to become a very challenging issue for lay church people. We hope through the angle of love of nature expressed by Christians of diverse tradition, we can build a common ground for build a common ground of discussion, Protestant or Catholic, to express the faith. Okay. Now I reach the third point, interaction of artistic language and linguistic language. We chose two Chinese Christian artists' work, one Catholic artist, Ping Liu, for her paper cutting work, a Protestant artist, Qing Li, for her flower arrangement work. This work began with the project that I collaborated with Professor K.K. Yo to create a platform called for Christian literary writers, artists, theologians. The collection's name is Art et Canonica. We hope to find a shared communicative space for them to communicate their center of interest on Christian faith. Qing Li and Ping Liu belong to different Christian traditions, and they both chose the combination of language and artistic work for their creation. In Protestant tradition, language has a central role in the theological training and church ministry due to the focus on the scripture. In Catholic tradition, the iconic work has a very important place originated from their meditative tradition. We happily find the combination of these two channels, language and artistic form, in both artists. So both Li and Liu have also diverse professional and life experiences. Li was a medical science researcher for many years. She developed her passion for flower arrangement first as a hobby, then it became an important spiritual expression. She published her first flower arrangement book in the collection of Art et Canonica. And Liu is a practicing artist. Her work was collected in different museums, and she is actively involved in presentation, in publication. At the same time, she is also a school teacher and explores how to integrate paper cutting in her Chinese teaching practice. Both artists' profiles are good examples of balance among work, arts, faith. I consider it a healthy and balanced and also practical, applicable way to express the faith. Okay, so we introduce their work, the fourth point, the fragrance part, Qing Li's work, a flower arrangement work. In the book of fragrance part, Qing narrated her spiritual life and represented with the flower arrangement. She went through a spiritual reflection through her learning process. At the beginning, she learned to release the stress in work. Then she realized the essence of this art is to discover each flower's own beauty and make it appealing to man's inner quest about the beauty of the creation. In the book, the family warmth, the spiritual pursuit, found their unique expression in coordination of colors, shapes of flowers. The outcome of flower arrangement provides a very flexible interpretation of its symbolic meaning. It gave the reader the freedom to connect it with their own life experiences At the same time, Qing's writing, which accompanied the flower, revealed the initial inspiration of her work. Her writing expressed her appreciation of the daily life blessing, her reflection on her life transition from a medical researcher to a dedicated wife and mother. Her narration made the flower arrangement more meaningful. The art of flower arrangement and her writing helped her to comprehend more in depth the relation between God and human. She also learned to appreciate the uniqueness of each individual and their full flourishment, like she understands the beauty of each flower. Okay, I reached the fifth point, Heavenly Grace, a book authored by Lucy Liu. Lucy Liu's work combined the traditional Chinese art paper cutting with her poetry writing. It formed a very special artistic form. The traditional paper cutting usually explores themes like harvest, flora, legendary figures, but Liu's work explored Christian themes that were usually depicted in Western artists like oil painting, sculpture, stained glass. This work helps Chinese Christians to find a familiar art form to express their faith. It provides also a good example of combination of Christian identity and Chinese identity. The paper cutting art has its own characteristic because it could not have the same freedom to use color like the painting or abstract expression like the language. The artist should use very simple lines to express her themes. It obliged the artist to prioritize her spiritual inspiration, find her strongest feeling, and express it in a very simple and expressive way through the line created by the scissors. It has some similarity with the modern arts. For instance, the French painter Henri Matisse used the same method to create his own style. So, like the Chapel of Vannes, Chapelle de Vence, in southern France, I personally visited the Chapelle of de Vence. The stained glass in this chapel deeply impressed me by its simple line and very vivid colors. He was also inspired by paper cutting arts. Liu explored this unique artistic form to depict her understanding about silence, silent seeking, Garden of Eden, dialogue with the nature. Her poetry writing is also succinct, simple, which coordinates well with the paper cutting's characteristic. At the same time, her poetry also provides a more abstract expression to elaborate some themes depicted in her paper cutting work, especially like the theme of silence. It helps the reader to understand her initial inspiration, her spiritual pursuit, her understanding of some important theological themes like meditation, dialogue between human and the nature. Liu also holds workshop of paper cutting arts. I personally participated in one. I experienced the difficulty to hold properly the scissor, create expressive lines and images. Liu, through her teaching, taught also the self-confidence, the training of mastering the hands, keep the image in mind constant and clear. I personally expressed the process of progression in all this basic skill mastery in coordination with the spiritual practice. It's very similar to the prayer process, seeking for calling, using an image to express it, put into concrete realization of their life. The paper cutting arts is also a way to know my inner voice, find creative way to express it, and go through diligent skill training to push it forward to perfection. Now I reach my conclusion. In this work, through analysis of two artists' work, we explore spiritual expression, which blend the language, artistic form like the flower arrangement and paper cutting, to express the artist's spiritual pursuit and aesthetic aspiration. We consider this holistic approach is helpful to build a common ground for Christians of diverse tradition, Protestant or Catholics. For Protestant Church, it enriched the faith expression exclusively dependent on biblical studies. It eased the tension created by diversity of biblical interpretation. because in this approach, the language plays a role of inspiring, suggesting, explaining artists' initial inspiration instead of imposing and judging. At the same time, this simple, practical, and holistic approach reconciliates the tension between Christian identity and Christian identity and Chinese identity. They find a common ground in the appreciation of the nature, a divine creation. So in current society, the environment protection became a very important topic. It's also a bridge that can connect Christian with people from diverse culture and diverse spiritual tradition through the inner transformation. Through this work, we reflect upon the following question: how each individual can find a creative way to describe their spiritual pursuit, their aesthetic aspiration, and how the Christian faith can provide rich themes and guidance for their exploration. So let's finish with a biblical verse There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. I'll show a few slides of their work.
Oh, please.
This is Qin Li's work.
Flower arranging.
This is a paper cutting work of Lucy Liu.
Wow.
Okay, this is the link that you can find the work online.
I'm Marita Goodson, and I'm chair of our local San Jose Diocese for, we would say Care for Creation, but we call it Stewards of Our Common Home. And one of the great issues I think we have is engaging people, and that's why I wanted to, if I may, direct a question to Margaret about the you spoke of sharing stories of engaging participants. I mean, the engagement of people and that's the great issue, that, engaging people in living more simple lifestyles, all of us. And I'm just wondering what lessons you could share with us.
You mean in China?
Yes.
Well, it started off wonderfully with the first public hearing that they held. But what happened was they held a public hearing, but they did not give the public members in advance what the documents entailed, what sort of project and what sort of impact it would have. So unfortunately, the public hearing became another protest. So when you engage the public, just don't do it for the sake of just checking off the list of we got the public to participate. It has to be meaningful. So public has to be respected. They have to understand the details of what's going to be. And so, it's not a matter of just engaging the public. You got to make it meaningful and be thoughtful.
So do you
Thank
have
you very
any lessons for bringing that to the United States, making it meaningful? And,
We do it all the time.
we try so many different things, whether it's science or whether it's studying Laudato Si in small groups, or training lay professionals, engaging our bishops where they're open to that. But still, if we look at our society, we're not really changing.
Marita, I will tell you, this is a very big issue that you have addressed, and a very important one. I think we're going to spend the next decade reflecting on that question.
Jerry Ko, I taught in China English for 4 years in Chongqing. My question regarding China's environment is that, is it really fair for the Chinese government to commit itself so much? I don't know, it's their own willingness or voluntary, or is it because of the Western countries' pressure? But it seems to me United States and British, they've had so many years of developing their technology and industry, and now because of the world climate situation, they are more concentrated on climate change. China's commitment, is it forced by the Western countries, or it's probably both? Partly because of China's international workshop, which caused its climate to be so detrimental. But of course, they see there's a reason to catch up. But is there, the West countries are trying to give China only a few years' time compared to their own almost centuries of industrialization. Is that fair? Or can China really do it?
Yes, I think that we have to be very delicate in the way that we deal with China in the West, especially given China's history with the West. Going back to the gunboat diplomacy, the Opium Wars, etc., which many of my ancestors were responsible for, both on the Portuguese side and on the British side. So we cannot be seen to be talking down and ordering China. So we have to be extremely diplomatic, I believe. And it has to be done with Chinese characteristics.
Wait, I'm going to grab and mention something.
We don't always.
Yeah. One is China, they want to be a world leader. To be a world leader, they have to prove something. So that's one of the reasons why they will. And number two, leapfrogging. You don't have to wait 20, 30 years to advance. Technology is there. EV, electric vehicles. And, we have solar roofs. Where are they most coming from? It's from China. So it's in China's interest. It's not so much the pressure from the West. China wants clean technology. And because of the protests, also for domestic reasons, but there are various reasons why they want to do this.
Very good. It's also true that there are more models. You don't have to advance or develop or industrialize as the West did. You don't have to recreate the Western lifestyle in China, because that lifestyle was ultimately unsustainable, and we've come to realize that. So that we all have to find a new model and commit to it. So I think that that's a common responsibility. But simply saying, well, you did it, so we're going to do it now, I'm not sure that that is the most adequate response. And I tend to think that once China decides to do something, it does it big,
And if I could add a little bit to what Margaret said about solar panels. China is obviously the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. And they have managed to bring the price of solar panels down to about 20% of what they were 10, 12 years ago, which is an incredible achievement. So we need to thank China for having done that amongst many other things. That was a wonderful achievement, I think. So thank you, China.
Although in manufacturing solar panels, you pollute.
The unfortunate other side of that is that a lot of China's production was exported. It wasn't like they were consuming 80% of that in China. And you talk about electronic vehicles. And you have to also look at the consumption of coal. If coal continues at 65%, maybe 70% of energy consumption, I mean, the reason for electronic vehicles, hopefully, is to reduce the carbon emissions. And so far, those two haven't been connected.
But if I can add just one other thing, the OBOR, One Belt, One Road program that Mr. Xi Jinping has initiated, this is very much part of their foreign policy and also their environmental policy. But unfortunately, you mentioned coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels. Since OBOR started, China has built on the routes of these various routes more than 240 coal-fired power plants. in the countries that OER goes through. And so we've got to try and square that circle somehow. Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, there is some concern that that's a kind of a new colonialism that's emanating from China rather than being inflicted on China. So that really is a concern. But I think Cureto, Dr. Yen, opened up a broader set of perspectives. What does faith bring to the question? And can China cooperate with the church, with people of faith, on addressing this issue? Because there is a question of mobilization. How do you get people on board with these issues? How do you get them involved with these issues? And there really is an opportunity here. Both Xi Jinping became president and Francis became pope around the same time. And there were initial exchanges, and this is a common issue that all human beings face. So I wonder, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about or questions for Dr. Yen on this question of faith and environment.
I just want to add, and I want to ask, in the area of, I want to add the word subnational. The church is a subnational entity. It's not a nation. And we use the word international when sometimes we mean global because of this relationship between nation states. And what Margaret said was absolutely spot on about first identifying that civil society is that zone, that place in which so much of the ecological movement has taken place. Civil society does not really exist in the PRC. And so I would like to know if you would like to comment on the strength of the idea of green as being something that is specifically ecological civilization, and yet the word green and the idea of living green is going beyond just the idea of being environmentally responsible, but being spiritually responsible, socially responsible. Has that been your experience? Can you comment on your perspective from the pavilion on the experience of green, which is this very ill-defined, simple word?
China is somewhat in transition, and the experience of industrialization of China is can offer something. There was much competitions among provinces. To previously it was more on GDP, achievement, but nowadays something has changed. They speak about green GDP. So it's not just GDP development, but also taking into consideration of
excellent.
And
the last one.
I remember I was in Shijiazhuang in the seminary, and it was very polluted, and it was winter time, and the Chinese the Chinese government, they promised something, they would keep that promise. And people were not able to put on fire the heating with coal because the only available energy was coal. That was the source. So people have to even make sacrifices. So I think clean energy is something that we need also international collaboration. Now, of course. China has, there is also gas coming from Russia because they have to build the pipes. It takes time. And so I think it's very important, this climate change meetings, like the one in Glasgow, or that all leaders sit together, and somehow now the Holy See is, as an observer, of the United Nations, also of these commissions of climate change. I think it's very, very important because the Holy See is not an entity, it's not a political entity without economic or political interest. So how Pope Francis is committing himself in this sense, I think there's also hope that China will follow, no? As Margaret was saying, that as a leader in developing countries, it can contribute really for humanity. And there are scholars, American scholars, which are very optimistic. I mean, saying that China's commitment can be, China's experience can they believe that this ecology civilization objective is written in the constitution now. There's a big possibility that they can achieve some goals.
I want to share a comment from one member in our online audience. This is from Teresa McNichol, and she writes, "The backlash of ignorance directed towards Asian Americans shows sadly a lack of education of American students. I've taught a college Asian art history survey for 25 years, and students loved learning about Chinese culture and wisdom and spiritual traditions. I never understood why similar courses aren't a requirement of all students." Mm-hmm. So it gives us something to reflect on. And again, I want to thank all of our presenters and thank all of you for joining us.